Hi, everyone, and welcome back. This is the second little mini lecture that I'm doing on Vietnam, the second and final lecture, actually. We were already really close to the end of this unit when we left school last week, so this really is just the wrap-up piece today. So last time we talked about 1968, the fact that it is viewed as this really tumultuous year, which it is, because it's the biggest year of the war. It's the year of the Tet Offensive. It's the year that the credibility gap really starts to widen for many Americans. And so now we're going to talk about really the beginning of the end, about the 1968 elections, and about Nixon's presidency and his sort of role in the Vietnam War. So the Vietnam War had really consumed a lot of President Johnson's term. We know that he had been really dedicated to the issue of civil rights, and he'd really wanted to pursue civil rights legislation. But unfortunately, as the years went on, the Vietnam War started sucking up a lot more of just his time and attention and American, funds. And he definitely, I think, was getting the sense that, he was stuck in Vietnam. By 1968, his approval ratings had really plummeted. People were just generally pretty unhappy with him. And so President Johnson makes the kind of shocking announcement in 1968 that he was not going to be running for re-election. He had only served one full term on his own, so he was eligible to serve a second term. But he announced that he wasn't going to. And this is a pretty iconic photo of Johnson, which I think really sums up how he probably was feeling in 1968. Very sort of depressed and overwhelmed with the whole situation in Vietnam. And the person who sort of takes over is this guy, Richard Nixon. We've seen him before. Richard Nixon, we had talked about him in way back when we talked about what unit was that? I don't know, I guess unit 6, when we were covering the Cold War or the United States in the 1950s and 60s. Remember that Nixon had initially tried to run against John F. Kennedy in 1960, in the 1960 election, and he had lost. He had been the vice president at the time. He was the guy who did the kitchen debates, so we know Nixon. We're sort of familiar with him. So Nixon gives it a second shot. He was the Republican nominee for president, and he is running in 1968 on a platform of a number of issues, but one big thing he did promise to a lot of Americans is that he could bring victory in Vietnam. And the very classic Nixon pose is this. He stands there with his two hands, his two arms outstretched with the peace sign on them. And it's not just a peace sign he's going to bring peace to Vietnam. It's also a V. V for victory, victory in the election, as well as victory in Vietnam. And so that was part of sort of Nixon's campaign promise to the Americans, is that if you elect me, I can get us out of this terrible war that the Democrats got us into. And so here's what happened. Nixon did get elected by quite a lot. He had been running up against this guy, Hubert Humphrey, who had been Johnson's vice president. But as you can probably tell on the map, Humphrey won all the states in blue, so he didn't do particularly well. And then there was also a third-party candidate, actually, and that was George Wallace. George Wallace had been the governor of Alabama, and he was basically a huge racist. He was the person who had resisted the civil rights movement. He was someone who had literally said, segregation now, segregation forever, and had barred students of color from entering universities, physically. He himself had barred them. So he was all around a pretty bad person, I would say. So one thing that's kind of striking to me is just knowing that he was able to gain enough traction and looking at the states that he won. He won states in the Deep South, which I think reveals a lot. about the situation in 1968. You still had a lot of people who were willing to support a super racist candidate, and you still had enough people who were willing to vote for someone like that he could win those entire states. So I think the election in 1968 is important for us to keep in mind, not just because of the whole Nixon thing, but also just, keeping in mind that the civil rights movement is still going on and it's still making progress, but there are still challenges that it's facing. So one of the things that Nixon had promised, like I said, was that he had promised the Americans that he had some top secret plan to get us out of Vietnam. During the election, he had not really, expanded on what that secret plan was. But as we saw with Johnson, and as we've seen with a lot of other presidents in the past and in the present, presidents often make these big campaign promises when they're trying to get elected because they want people to vote for them, and they can't always follow through on those promises. Just like Johnson had promised in 1964 that he wasn't going to escalate the war in Vietnam, and then he did, Nixon is going to promise that he's got a plan to get us out of Vietnam, and that plan is, I think, not what a lot of Americans were hoping for. Nixon had promised that he could get us peace with honor. And so that's not necessarily what maybe he achieved. So normally, if we were in class, this would be the time when I would be having you read excerpts from his address to the nation in 1969. Unfortunately, we are not in class. So I'll post that on Google Classroom for you to check out on your own, but we are just going to skip ahead, and spoiler alert, I'm going to tell you what he said. He claimed peace with honor, and then he cut a deal to keep the war going. Essentially, in 1968, Nixon is elected, but he's not able to immediately withdraw troops from Vietnam, and he's not immediately able to secure a victory or to secure this peace with honor, quote unquote, whatever that meant. And so for a lot of Americans, I think they felt like a little bit tricked. So Nixon's plan was not to have an immediate troop withdrawal from Vietnam, which I think was what a lot of Americans wanted in 1968. They were sick of the war, they were sick of the expense and the drama and the trauma of the war, and they wanted all the Americans out of there. That wouldn't necessarily realistically work. If you withdraw all American troops from a situation like Vietnam, you leave essentially a power vacuum. We knew that if we immediately withdrew, then the situation was going to collapse. What Nixon wanted to do was what he called Vietnamizing the war. So he believed that by sending so many troops to Vietnam, we had Americanized the war. We had sort of taken over. We'd been doing most of the work. If you think back to that political cartoon that we looked at in class a couple of weeks ago, where it was like the man pulling the cart, and it was like a before and after. Like at first, the Vietnamese were pulling the cart while the American general was sitting back and smoking his cigar. And then after the Tonkin Resolution, it was like we were having to do all the work. Yeah. So Nixon essentially thought that we had Americanized the war by sending so many of our troops there to sort of do all of the heavy lifting. And what he wanted to do is make the Vietnamese sort of shoulder the burden. He wanted to slowly shift the responsibility for the war to South Vietnam, to their military and to their government. And so what that meant was that we were going to be withdrawing from Vietnam, but very, very gradually. Because in order for the South Vietnamese to sort of stand on their own, we had to support them as they learned how to do that. Part of this plan for Nixon meant heavy bombing in Cambodia and Laos, because both of these countries, we've talked about them before, the Ho Chi Minh Trail runs kind of in between the borders of Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia. And we've talked about like Operation Rolling Thunder and Operation Barrel Roll had targeted those areas as well, because they were trying to eliminate the Ho Chi Minh Trail, because they were trying to eliminate the Viet Cong supply line. So by this point in time, there were significant communist strongholds in both countries. And so Nixon is thinking, if we bomb them, we can eliminate any sort of communist threats around South Vietnam and give South Vietnam more of a fighting chance to stand up on their own to the North Vietnamese military. A lot of Americans did not agree with this strategy because, again, when you bomb other countries, like you're bringing conflict to another country that isn't, at war with us technically. So that became sort of a big issue. You'll remember when we talked about the anti-war movement, the Kent State protests where those students were shot and killed by the National Guard. This is what they were protesting. They were protesting heavy bombing in Cambodia by the Nixon administration. So anyways, the gradual troop withdrawal is taking place, and it takes a while. I mean, Nixon gets elected in 1968, and he's in office in January of 1969, and it takes about 3.5 years before the last American troops leave. And so I think that was not what many Americans had pictured when he had said, I'm going to get us out of Vietnam, I've got a plan, peace with honor, etc. But it's what they got. A lot of people didn't have very optimistic views about Vietnamization. They thought that this was not going to work out in the long run. This political cartoon, we can see that Vietnamization is a scarecrow, and obviously the purpose of a scarecrow is to scare the crows away, and it is not very effective in this scenario. So the belief of the artist is that, clearly Vietnamization it's sort of a sham. It's not really going to work. It's not going to be effective. And sooner or later, the North Vietnamese are going to catch on to that, and they are going to, take this down. Nixon found himself kind of just like Johnson in the same situation of being really weighed down by the conflict in Southeast Asia. In this cartoon, we can see Nixon trying to sort of wade through the rivers in what looks like the jungles of Vietnam, and he's literally being weighed down by the burdens, by the conflict in Vietnam, the bombings, and the conflicts in Cambodia and Laos both. And you can kind of get the idea that if those burdens become much heavier, and it looks like, by the motion lines the artist has drawn up here, if those burdens get much heavier much more quickly, Nixon is going to sink, right? He's not going to be able to be successful. And then lastly, this one's a bit brutal, but here we have Nixon. We know it's him because of the classic 2 arms outstretched with the peace sign pose, going through the Vietnam meat grinder, which is really sad. It's destroying him, literally destroying him. And if you look really closely, actually, the artist has given us some details here. Someone who's already gone through the meat grinder, we can see LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, we know. So it's really the idea that Vietnam destroys these presidents. Vietnam becomes like the thing, the sort of characteristic of their presidency, what is remembered about their presidency, and not in a good way. Something else happens in 1971 that is very disturbing to a lot of Americans and just really further erodes all the legitimacy about the Vietnam War, and these are the Pentagon Papers. So essentially, someone who worked at the Pentagon got access to these top secret classified files, read them, and decided, holy crap, this is crazy. They leaked the news to the Washington Post and the New York Times, who then published this information in the media. And what the classified documents had said was that the United States had been conducting both covert and overt, so open, secret and sort of open, operations in Vietnam in 1964. The United States had been spying on North Vietnam. We kind of talked about this already in class, but it laid it out very clearly. The U.S. had been spying and conducting other types of small missions in North Vietnam before the Tonkin incident. So we were clearly not the totally innocent party that the government had said we were when we were suddenly attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin. The other thing that we Americans found out in 1971 was that actually in the Gulf of Tonkin, when the USS Maddox had been hanging out there, we hadn't just been fired upon by the North Vietnamese patrol ships. We had actually fired the first shots. The USS Maddox had fired 3 shots at these North Vietnamese patrol boats. So again, it wasn't what Americans had been told, and what I told you guys in class. Remember, I told you, this isn't the full truth. I'll tell you the rest later. This is it. We had not been the totally innocent party that the government had said we had been. We had fired first at the North Vietnamese patrol ships, and they had returned fire. So that is becomes really, just sort of earth-shattering for a lot of Americans, because the whole reason we sent all those troops to Vietnam was based on the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which had allowed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution to pass. The fact that the government had told Americans, they told Congress, that we were attacked, we were victims of the North Vietnamese. We clearly had to get involved, and now none of that seemed true. On top of that, there had been reports in 1964 that there had maybe been a second attack on a different ship, not the USS Maddox, but a second ship. And these Pentagon papers revealed that second attack never actually happened. That was something that had basically been fabricated. So a lot of Americans felt like in 1971 that this was no longer a really legitimate war, that we'd gotten involved on the premise that we were victims in some kind of situation, and we weren't. And so a lot of Americans feel really betrayed by their government in that point. So eventually, like I said, the United States slowly withdrew their troops, and by 1973, the last American troops left Vietnam. But by 1975, literally 2 years later, South Vietnam fell to North Vietnam. Like, the North Vietnamese invaded and took over and made it a communist country. So that was really like just, I don't know, like a slap in the face, I guess, that we'd been there for all those years. We'd spent all that money. I mean, close to $1 trillion there. We'd spent close to 60,000 American lives and millions of Vietnamese lives, only to have the North Vietnamese win in the end. And it felt really pointless to a lot of Americans. It felt really upsetting, compounded with the fact that we didn't, now Americans are feeling like, why did we get involved in this in the first place? So there were a lot of negative after effects of the Vietnam War. This is a great resource as a way to review, which will probably be, helpful for you since we are not having regular class anymore. So please do check that out on your free time. John Green does the crash course videos, which I think are really helpful and great, but he does talk really fast. So check it out, see if it's helpful. But yeah. You've looked at some of these data points before when you did the document analysis, but it just kind of reiterates the fact that the Vietnam conflicts were hugely expensive in terms of the loss of life for Americans, but also really for the Vietnamese. This was a huge, huge deal for them. One sort of last impact I want to touch on here of the Vietnam War that's maybe sort of like the silver lining is that Americans realized that they didn't want to get into another Vietnam in the future. And so Congress passed in 1973 something called the War Powers Act. And what this does is it requires the president to give Congress notice, 48 hours notice, so 2 days, before sending troops into a hostile area without a declaration of war. So if this had been in place in 1964, President Johnson would have had to basically tell Congress, hey, I'm going to send troops to a hostile area. I'm not declaring war yet, but I'm sending troops. And then he would have to wait 2 days. And in those 2 days, Congress can take steps if they want to prevent him from actually doing that. So it's a way for him to sort of check the president's power. The other thing that the War Powers Act does is that it requires that if those troops are going to be in hostile territory for more than 90 days, so for more than about 3 months, the president is going to have to go to Congress and get additional approval, like basically get an extension, like, can I keep these troops here a little longer? Here's why. Or he needs to ask Congress to make a declaration of war. So all of this is intended to prevent what Johnson did in 1964. It's intended to prevent another Gulf of Tonkin resolution that gave the president a lot of free rein to conduct a war without actually having to declare it. So the political cartoon that we see here has President Nixon finding out about this War Powers Act and feeling a little bit sort of, upset about it. He says, imagine Congress trying to curb my right to conduct unconstitutional wars. Why, that's unconstitutional. So there was definitely maybe a sentiment among Nixon, at least this artist perceives it, that, this was an infringement on the president's right to conduct, needed military actions. But for a lot of other Americans, I think this was it felt good to them to know that there was some kind of check on the president's power. The War Powers Act doesn't actually last forever. we'll see in the future that President Bush, both of them will end up sending troops to the Middle East without having to declare war, but we will talk about that later. So that's it for this little mini lecture, and that's sort of it for the Vietnam War. Please make sure that you are keeping up with the textbook reading, that you are doing the topic 9 assessment on a piece of binder paper, so that you're making sure that you know kind of what will be on the test, and I will be making a few more of these short lecture videos for the sort of next chapter. So enjoy, please keep taking care of yourselves, and check in with me as needed. Thanks.